Many of these babies themselves were AIDS orphans because their parents had died from AIDS. And so when they got sick, they would come to the hospital. They would either be brought to the hospital by their grandmothers because the parents may well have both died, so they were AIDS orphans. Or sometimes they'd come with mom, and we test the baby would be HIV positive. We test mom, she would be HIV positive. And then we'd ask mom to, bring dad for testing as well. And that would often be the last time we would see mom, and we very seldom saw dad. So we had these babies that were essentially abandoned. We had a corner of the ward that we dedicated to these AIDS babies, and we could feed them and we could count them. Every morning we'd do our ward rounds and we would say, how many patients did we admit overnight and how many patients died overnight? And so I would say, Michael, there is nothing more heartbreaking than watching babies die and watching babies die alone.
Hello and welcome back to the Pharmaverse Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack. And if you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, well, then you're in the right place because we interview the brightest stars from all the corners of the pharma universe. And today's guest would certainly fit that description. We're joined by Eslie Dennis, MD, who's the Global Head of Medical Affairs at Kyowa Kirin. Eslie Dennis, welcome to the Pharmaverse. Well, your time in industry has been so fascinating and very accomplished. We're going to get to all those things. But first, I want to know what it's like to grow up in Africa. Tell us about that.
Thank you so much for that question, Michael. Africa will always have a very special place in my heart. Africa is a really fascinating continent. Firstly, Africa is huge. It's the second largest continent after Asia and bigger than all of the US and China and most of Europe combined. And it's actually made up of 54 different countries. So there's tremendous diversity in Africa, not just between countries, but also within countries. I think the other piece about Africa is that each of those 54 countries has their own unique identity and cultures and histories. The other piece about Africa is that it's definitely a continent of sharp contrasts. So we see deep-rooted traditional beliefs and customs, alongside modernization. We see extreme poverty and extreme wealth, and we see peace and conflict. So Africa is actually quite a complex continent. But for me, as a child, growing up in Africa, it was truly magical. I would say idyllic. I can't imagine a better childhood than growing up in Africa. I was born in South Africa, but I grew up on a farm on an agricultural college just outside of Lusaka in Zambia. And my dad was a microbiologist and my mom a geography teacher, and both wonderfully supportive and loving parents. And my brother and I went to school at the International School of Lusaka. And Michael, I think we probably had over 50 different nationalities represented between the students and the teachers. And so to be different was actually the norm. And people were super excited to learn about you. They were curious about where you came from, what your country was like. So I got the chance to grow up in an environment that genuinely embraced this true welcoming and curiosity. I think the other piece about growing up in Africa was that I had the freedom to grow up outdoors. So, when we weren't doing homework or at school, we were running around outside, either on the farm or in the bush. My parents taught us how to look out for snakes and for four-legged animals. And other than that, we were outdoors in nature until the sun came down, and then it was time to go home for, supper time and bedtime. So this freedom to explore was really significant. And we also did not have much in the way of technology. So we did not have a telephone for the first 13 years of my life. And that seems so inconceivable today when everybody's carrying a cell phone in their pocket. But no telephone. We had a black and white TV, one channel for the whole country. And my parents significantly restricted our TV time, but instead they showered us with books. So from the earliest stages, I was an avid reader. And so for me, my childhood was really around this freedom to explore the outdoors, freedom to explore nature. and freedom to explore inside my imagination. So really, really magical, with amazing parents who supported me and my brother through, our entire lives. So great childhood. Thanks for the question, Mike.
So when did you decide that you wanted to be a doctor?
So I have always wanted to become a doctor ever since I could remember. But I think there are probably three things that really influenced my decision to pursue medicine. The first is my dad. So my dad grew up under the apartheid regime in South Africa as a colored man, and that's how we're classified in South Africa, being of mixed race. And his parents did not have any money, so going to medical school was just not a possibility for my dad. And he channeled his dream through me and through my brother. And he opened up our eyes to this amazing, incredible world of science and biology. And I have many happy memories of going on these nature walks with dad and my brother, and we'd collect these specimens and bring it back to his lab, and then we'd look at it under the microscope. And my dad was always encouraging us to look beyond the obvious, dig deeper, always questioning. So I think dad played a very significant role in my wanting to become a physician. I think the second factor was growing up in Africa, being acutely aware of the poverty and the hardship around us. I think, from a very early stage, I remember feeling immensely grateful for all the blessings and the gifts in my life, and how important it was to be able to give back and to be able to make a difference in the lives of others.
That really is like encapsulates who I know you to be.
Yeah,
Is that giving back person?
absolutely. And I think when you recognize that you have the ability to give back, we really must. I mean, that's what life is about. It's about giving back and making that difference. I think the third factor that weighed into my decision was one of those very serendipitous, pivotal moments. I think I was probably about 9 or 10, and I was watching a TV program it was all about the flying doctor service in Zambia. And the concept of being able to get into the small plane and fly to these remote and otherwise unreachable parts of the country to really save lives, that was so exciting and so exhilarating to me. And so I was determined from that stage on to be not only a doctor, but also to be a flying doctor. And I got my chance actually to see what this would be like when I was in medical school. So, Michael, I went to medical school in Zimbabwe, and as part of our curriculum, we had to do these attachments at different rural hospitals. And one of the hospitals I was assigned to was a hospital called Karunda Mission Hospital. And to get there, I was told the mission pilot was going to fly me there. So, as you can imagine, I am beyond excited. My dream of becoming a flying doctor is going to come true. So here I am. It's one bright sunny morning, and I go out into the airfield, and there I am, hopping on board this two-seater Cessna with the pilot, and the plane's loaded with supplies for the hospital as well as for a couple of the clinics along the way. So we set off, we take off, and now it's the middle of our African summer. And so one thing you become very acutely aware of is that the sun is beating down on you, and you're in this tiny plane and you can't pull the blinds because you're sitting next to the pilot. So you're it's all this heat that's coming down on you. And then you have all of these different air pockets. And so as you hit an air pocket, the plane is bouncing along and bouncing along. And I soon realized that I did not have the constitution to handle all of this bumpiness. And then it got even worse, Michael, because we had to drop off supplies at these different smaller clinics. And again, there's no airstrips in these villages. There's just one dirt road. And so the plane is circling the dirt road a few times so that all the people and all the animals can clear the road and the plane can land safely. And so now you're trying to, you're circling at this acute angle, which is not helping me feel any better. So we did this a couple of times, and by the time we finally got to Karunda Mission Hospital, I was so ill. It took me a couple of days to recover, And it really shattered my dream of becoming a flying doctor. So I then had to, be content with being a doctor with my feet firmly planted on the ground.
That's an incredible story. And it's so true that sometimes the things we think about that we want to do may not be really what we're made to do. But I got to say, you chose a really impactful time to be a doctor in Africa during the AIDS epidemic. Give us a snapshot of that. I've heard some of these stories. Tell us one.
Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly a choice. It was really just how my life unfolded. I went to medical school. I started medical school in 1982. That seems such a long time ago. Um, and at that time, AIDS had been reported in the literature, but it was really just a paragraph in the literature about this immunodeficiency disease that affected certain specific groups of people. And so that was in 1982. And I graduated from medical school at the end of 1986. I think that the real turning point with the awareness of AIDS really happened in 1985. That's when the actor Rock Hudson had died, and I think really put a face to AIDS and really spearheaded research into AIDS and the quest to find a cure. So, the first antiretroviral for HIV was actually approved in March of 1987, which was the year that I started working as a junior doctor, by which stage that the numbers of AIDS patients in Africa had really soared dramatically. But even though AZT was approved in the United States, it was not available in public hospitals in Zimbabwe until 2004. So here I am, it's the beginning of 1987. We're just surrounded by all of these AIDS patients that we're admitting to the hospital, and we have no treatments to provide for these patients. I mean, all we can do is really hold their hands while they're dying. And I remember the very first patient that died under my care was a man who had full-blown AIDS. And, his face, his name will forevermore be etched in my memory. And it was absolutely heartbreaking to know that we were completely incapable of saving these patients. I think what was even more heartbreaking, Michael, was when I moved to the pediatric wards. And so, the maternal to child vertical transmission, that was unchecked. And so we had all these babies that were born with AIDS. Many of these babies themselves were AIDS orphans because their parents had died from AIDS. And so when they got sick, they would come to the hospital. They would either be brought to the hospital by their grandmothers because the parents may well have both died, so they were AIDS orphans. Or sometimes they'd come with mom, and we test the baby would be HIV positive. We test mom, she'd be HIV positive. And then we'd ask mom to, bring dad for testing as well. And that would often be the last time we would see mom, and we very seldom saw dad. So we had these babies that were essentially abandoned. We had a corner of the ward that we dedicated to these AIDS babies, and we could feed them and we could count them. Every morning we'd do our ward rounds and we would say, how many patients did we admit overnight and how many patients died overnight? And so I would say, Michael, there is nothing more heartbreaking than watching babies die and watching babies die alone. Um, myself, my colleagues, our nursing staff, whenever we had a break, we try and hold one of these babies, just to give them some small measure of warmth and comfort and love. But, it's woefully inadequate for these tiny, tiny babies and their impossibly short lives. But it brought into such sharp focus for me, Michael, that without life-changing and life-saving medications, here I was as this highly trained physician, completely incapable of saving these babies' lives. And so it was really a tremendously sad and heartbreaking time to be a doctor.
I can only imagine. And that's the story I remember. I can just picture you on a break holding a baby, that they don't have any parents, the whole thing. That is etched in my mind. Take that photograph of you holding one of those babies all alone and overlay that now with the Eslie Dennis, who's a pharmaceutical executive. How did that experience shape you as the leader that you are today?
I think it's a tremendously profound and transformational experience when you hold a dying baby in your hands and you look at this baby and they're so utterly vulnerable, they're fragile, and their whole lives are literally in your hands. And it's not just these babies, it's all of my patients. You recognize that as a physician, the lives of people depend upon that next decision you're going to make, depends upon what's going to be your next move for these patients. And so you realize the tremendous responsibility that you carry as a physician and these patients that depend upon you. I think bringing that into the pharmaceutical industry, firstly, in my time, I've now seen how life-changing medications, life-saving medications like AZT and other antiretrovirals, how they've transformed a death sentence into a chronic disease. So it makes me feel immensely proud of the work that we do in the pharmaceutical industry, because without those medicines, there's so little that we can do as physicians. And so the work that we do is tremendously important. It's vitally important. And even though I may not be in the clinical trenches anymore, I'm still serving the needs of patients. And so I bring that patient front and center of everything that I do in my work. I make sure that we keep that front and center of everything that we do in our organization. And so for me, this is a tremendous, tremendous responsibility that I take very seriously in everything that I do each day.
As the leader of the team, do you have to remind your team sometimes about, because sometimes we get so focused on our job that it's not that we forget the patient, but we get so engrossed in that activity that we forget where we're actually heading as a team. Do you have to remind people and bring them back to that, you holding a baby kind of moment?
We have an incredible culture in our organization where patients are always front and center. So I think people come into the industry because they want to make a difference in the lives of patients. What we try and do is to make sure that we're always incorporating the voice of the patient and making sure that in each of the diseases or disease areas that we're in, that we truly looking at it from the point of view of the patient, that we're involving patients in how we shape our strategy and our plans and our clinical trials. And so I think it's important to continue to have that dialogue. But I do think that people join the pharmaceutical industry because they want to make that difference and find a way to make a difference in the lives of patients. Each one of us has been touched by illness in some way, shape, or form. Either we ourselves have been patients or our loved ones have been patients. So I think we all recognize the tremendous value of the work that we do and the importance of the work that we do.
Yeah, that's a good point. And now you're the global head of medical affairs at Kyowa Kirin. I heard you're the first female to be in this role. Um, so the term female leader, it's used often. In your opinion, is that overused or misused, or how do you feel about female leader?
I have some complicated feelings about the term female leadership. I recognize why we call it out as female leadership. We're trying to address the historic and ongoing disparities that we see when it comes to leadership. But, by calling out female leadership as separate from the general leadership terminology, I think sometimes it can reinforce stereotypes where people might assume that that broader leadership term is more male associated and that we have to carve out a special section for female leadership. But I know that we do that because as we're addressing these disparities, we have to be able to call out female leaders. We have to be able to identify who are role models, and we have to encourage women to pursue leadership roles. And so I think we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go in making sure that we have a level playing field. And I would like nothing more than to get to a time where we don't need the qualifier, where leadership is leadership, irrespective of what your gender is, and where both men and women have an equal opportunity to pursue that leadership advancement that they seek. But until that time that we get there, we have to continue to really reinforce how we ensure that women have the support that they need to get to those leadership levels.
I couldn't agree more. And if it's okay to say, I sort of feel the same way about race. If we keep saying, this race leader or this gender leader, then we're just we're I think getting further from where we want to be. And that person's a leader. It's a human being that's a leader. That's all it is. And so I agree with you. How have you seen, even in your time in industry, leadership opportunities for women change?
I think we've made progress, Michael. When I joined the industry, that was back in the late 1990s. And so many times I would be the only woman in the room. I would be the only woman on the executive committee. And, in the time that since that time, I've really seen that we've had more and more women in C-suite positions. In fact, I think the latest data suggests that there's 29% of C-suite positions are held by women in corporate America. But we are still woefully underrepresented at every level in the corporate pipeline. And so it is important that we continue to address those inequities. I was just reading recently the Lean in 2025 Women in the Workplace report. And what that report said was, while most companies continue to invest in diversity and inclusion, 1 in 6 companies has reduced the amount of staff or the amount of resources that they're applying to these programs and to these initiatives. And in fact, for the first time, they report that women are less likely to say that they want to be promoted compared to men. And the reason for that is that they do not see a clear path upwards for them. Women are less likely to have a sponsor. Women are less likely to have the support that they need to advance their careers. So I think it's really important that we continue to pay attention to this, ensure that our systems, our practices, our leadership, our support models are there to encourage women to be able to speak up, to be able to pursue their goals as well. But I think the other piece I would say is women should also not wait for somebody to offer them a hand. I think it's important that women are able to take the initiative and ask people for help, for assistance, for guidance. I think men have an easier time asking for help. And, I can speak for myself. I remember I used to feel very reticent to reach out to senior leaders. I would think, oh my gosh, this person is so busy. They have so many other important things to do. I don't want to disturb them or take up their important time. But what I've come to realize and recognize is that senior leaders really welcome the opportunity to help, to give advice, to give support, to spend time with people. And so I have over the years learned that sometimes I've been fortunate to have wonderful mentors. But even if I don't have a mentor, reaching out to someone and saying, hey, would you mind having coffee with me, or could I have lunch with you? I'd like to share with you some of my background and some of my aspirations and really get some advice from you in terms of how I can navigate my career path. And I've never met a leader who said no. And so I really think being able to reach out, take the initiative, have those conversations, those are the conversations that open up doors to so many other opportunities. So that's what I really would encourage all women and men to do as well.
That's great advice. And I want to get some more advice from you. If you could go back in time and talk to the Eslie Dennis that is moving into her first leadership role, what is the one single most important piece of wisdom you'd impart to her at that time?
Oh gosh, so many lessons I've learned along the way, Michael. I would say no is a complete sentence. And let me unpack that for you. For the longest time, Michael, I used to think that saying yes was the price of credibility. It was the price of career advancement. And so I would say yes to everything that came my way. Yes, yes, yes. But what I realized was that I was taking on so much and I was diluting my efforts. And sometimes I wasn't able to honor those commitments. So I was under-delivering, I was burning out, and I really wasn't focusing on the things that could really move the needle and that only I could do. And so what I've learned is the ability to prioritize and then to focus and to be very clear about what those priorities are and set the right expectations with all of my stakeholders. so that I can say yes to the things that are really important, but I can say no to those things that I know are not going to really help move the needle forward. And a no does not have to come with a long apology, doesn't have to come with a long justification. And a no does not mean that, it's a career limiting move, but it means that you can say yes to the things that really matter.
I like that. No is a complete sentence. So I'm going to hang on to that one. In our last discussion, you also spoke to me about challenges of hiring, retaining talent. Everybody has those. Do you have any Eslie Dennis secrets about how you evaluate talent beyond the resume?
Well, I think, Michael, hiring the right people for your team is probably one of the most important leadership tasks that we have. And I think what I've come to recognize is that, back in the day, we used to look at someone's resume as being a reflection of that person. But in today's age of ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, where resumes are all so polished and written by AI, a resume really tells you where that person has been, but it really doesn't tell you much about that person at all. And so for me, I think I start with really being very clear about what is the role that we're trying to hire for? And then what are the qualities that I'm looking for in that particular candidate? And then as we start looking to the interview process, for me, that begins before I've even met the candidate. And so that candidate will interact with, our talent acquisition managers. That candidate will interact with my senior executive assistant who's going to help them with their travel arrangements and with their logistics. That candidate will interface with the receptionist when they come to the front desk. And so I'll reach out to these folks and say, how did this person treat you? How did they make you feel? Because I think it's really important. How you treat everyone really matters. And then, of course, we have an interview process, and I think there's nothing that replaces an in-person interview process. I also like to, spend some time with that person, either have dinner with them, or have lunch with them. So they're in a different setting and you can see somebody in a more relaxed setting as well. And sometimes with lunches, I will also include my assistant. So, she's my right hand, the person who knows me the most, the person I interact with the most. So sometimes, the two of us will go with the candidate for lunch. And then there might be times I might excuse myself a little earlier and then leave the two of them to continue, conversation. And you'd be surprised sometimes if there are candidates whose behavior will change when the person they're trying to impress is not in the room. So I think these are all important flags along the way. And then I think the other piece, Michael, is when you're actually in the interview process and asking a number of questions, you ask questions around behaviors and actions and results. But I always leave time at the end to say to the candidate, well, do you have any questions of me? And I will say most candidates have done their homework and they come with very thoughtful questions around the company. Some of them have looked at my own background and they'll ask me questions about my leadership journey. But there is every now and again, I'll find a candidate who will say, no, I've got no questions. I'm all good. And I think that lack of curiosity, again, is somewhat of a red flag. And then I would say, finally, it's really those intangibles. What is this person's energy level? What is their communication style like and their personality? Will they blend in will they fit in with the rest of the team? And bringing them into the organization, will they raise the bar? What would that look like with this particular person? And then my last thing that I think of is, we do a lot of travel in our business. And so I think to myself, well, this candidate, what would it be like to travel with this person, to be on a 12-hour, international flight? How would this person manage, if we have delays or if luggage gets lost, would they stay calm? Will they roll with the punches? What kind of travel companion would this person be as well? So I think these are all the intangibles that make up, a person's character and a person's behaviors that make a big difference when you bring them into an organization, especially when you bring them into a smaller organization.
That was so rich with content and wisdom, and I learned a lot from there. The one thing I wrote down is a resume tells you where they've been, but not who they are. And I want to show my team that one. we have time for one last question. I think it's the perfect question to end on, especially with you. What kind of legacy do you hope to leave as a leader in industry?
Oh gosh. Well, Michael, I'd like to think that people would say she worked really hard, she cared deeply, she believed in a bigger mission, and she made a difference in the lives of those who she touched by helping them become their best selves. And in some small measure, she helped to heal the world. So if people would say that, I would be truly honored, and that would be really amazing.
Wow, touching. Well, sadly, that is all the time we have for today's episode. But again, you've left us with some unforgettable stories, things we'll be thinking about for a long time. So thank you for being on the Pharmaverse. I know I've been after you a long time to be on here, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Well, that concludes another episode of the Pharmaverse Podcast. We have many more outstanding leaders lined up for you, so make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single career-enhancing insight. But as for this episode, that's a wrap. See you next time on the Pharmaverse.